we, the jury, find George Zimmerman not guilty.
Right now, the not guilty verdict in the Zimmerman trial has touched off outrage nationwide. And next,
I've answered all these questions many times over the years.
Elliot Spitzer sits down one-on-one and stumbles when asked by Dominic if there was more than one prostitute. We'll have that interview coming up. And later,
we have to remember there's not a big printing press in Washington that just continually prints money over and over and over.
that man is a hypocrite. The GOP's hypocrisy in full effect. It turns out they got no problem spending other people's money as long as it goes to the people they like, people like the congressman who you just heard from. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French, and thanks so much for joining us here. You are looking at a situation playing out not first in Florida, but then later on, really nationwide here, at a country with more questions than answers after the Zimmerman verdict. The nation, it held its breath and waited for that verdict in one of the most closely watched trials of the year. The trial of Zimmerman touching off a national debate about a lot of things: race, justice or lack thereof, and yes, guns in America. And on Saturday night, as we all know now, Zimmerman was acquitted of both charges. And our senior political correspondent, Andrew Whitman, he joins us with more of the fallout. Andrew?
Well, Rich, it's been nearly 2 days since we got that verdict, and after that not guilty verdict came down, an outcry broke out across the country, as some felt the justice was not served. From prayers to protests.
Justice for Trayvon!
Reaction across the country over Saturday night's not guilty verdict in the George Zimmerman murder trial.
Not one more!
Speaking at an event in Washington, D.C., Attorney General Eric Holder called Trayvon Martin's death unnecessary.
The Justice Department shares your concern. I share your concern. And as we first acknowledged last spring, we have opened an investigation into this matter.
As the feds look for any potential civil rights violations, Martin's parents are considering a wrongful death lawsuit against Zimmerman. And Zimmerman could file civil suits of his own. His parents releasing a statement on their website today, claiming the state, quote, conducted a clearly malicious, unfounded prosecution, adding they hope, quote, all reasonable will be held fully accountable for their truly egregious actions. But those prosecutors stand by their case, saying they believe Zimmerman killed the 17-year-old in cold blood.
I think there was a struggle. At some point, Trayvon became aware of the gun and was backing up, and George Zimmerman shot him.
Zimmerman is now in hiding, his attorney claiming he will get his gun back and needs it now more than ever for his protection.
I don't know how he could not lawfully carry a gun at this point, since he's now lawfully allowed to carry one. This is the worst time in his life, isn't it?
So many people have voiced their opinions on the verdict in this case, though we still haven't heard from the 6 jurors who acquitted George Zimmerman, although one juror has reportedly now signed a book deal. Rich?
All right, Andrew, thank you very much. Now, I'll bring in our panel on this conversation. Michael Sussman, attorney who specializes in civil rights and constitutional law, also former assistant general counsel for the NAACP's national office. Dominic Carter, of course, a political journalist and author. Wilbur Aldridge, the Mid-Hudson Westchester regional director of the NAACP. Mayo Bartlett, former chief of the Bias Crimes Unit at the Westchester County District Attorney's Office, and Andrew Whitman, our senior correspondent, who you already met. Okay, let me start with you, Michael. I've heard conflicting takes on the prosecution here, in that one was these guys got dealt a really rough hand. The investigation was flawed from the beginning. They changed prosecutors. They inherited this thing 6 weeks into it, and because it got botched from the get-go, they were playing defense from jump. The second side, though, is this was a clown car. They did a horrible job of prepping witnesses, of having a coherent case. They overcharged. Which one is it? A crummy defense, or really these guys, coming late to the party?
One is they didn't overcharge. It's a case of murder. I think, if anything, it was made overcomplicated. The way I view this, very simply, is that the defendant in the case expressed deprecating motives, clearly was engaged in racial profiling from the moment he saw Trayvon Martin. and the case was a simple case. It was not that complex a case. Trayvon Martin was followed, pursued, apprehended for one reason. It's not because he was white. Had he been my son, he would not have been followed and pursued. I wasn't in the courtroom. They may have had problems with witnesses. The other thing, in my opinion, is this, very simply stated. If you're going to put in a self-defense defense, you better testify. You have a constitutional right not to testify, but the way I view it, if you want to get up and say that the action of shooting another person was in self-defense, you better be willing to take the witness stand, raise your arm, be subject to cross-examination. And I think, frankly, that should be the law. And as a constitutional lawyer, I understand that's serious, but I think that's what is needed.
But Mayo, a lot of people thought at the beginning of the trial that was going to happen out of necessity. You don't walk on murder case unless you make your own case. But by the time the prosecution was done, almost everybody I heard was they'd be crazy to let Zimmerman get there, because from the last person that Trayvon Martin spoke to, that the girl was a friend of his, her testimony, it changed many times to stand. She had trouble remembering details here. Apparently they prepped her in front of Trayvon's mother, so she gave a different account when they initially were preparing her for trial versus what she did. The medical examiner might as well have been on the defense's payroll after the performance that he gave on the stand. Do you, as a former prosecutor, say they should have done a better job, or could they have won this case even if they did everything right?
Absolutely should have been a better job. And if you took a rookie prosecutor who's right out of law school and they're trying their first case, they're going to be prepared to handle the matter, I think, more effectively than this prosecution
What
team.
did they do wrong?
They did lots of things wrong. Now, the discrepancies from the witnesses, every witness who testified had discrepancies or could have been challenged. The issues that I came up with basically were they had information that George Zimmerman had targeted similar individuals and called the police about other young African-American men multiple times. In fact, every time he called the police, it was virtually about an African-American man. They fought with the court to get that information in. The court said, yes, you can use it. The prosecution then chose not to. That's important because it goes to show his frame of mind, his motive, that this is not some type of a mistake. The other thing is that stand your ground applied equally to Trayvon Martin. I mean, Trayvon Martin is not charged with any, if he was alive, would not have been charged with any crime. No one's suggesting he did anything wrong that night other than simply be there and fall into a category that George Zimmerman felt was inappropriate to be there that time. So when Trayvon Martin actually is running away from George Zimmerman, according to George Zimmerman, and then he changes the story to he's skipping away, well, Trayvon Martin at that point has a reasonable belief that, why is this man following me? Perhaps I'm at risk of grave injury or death. He has every right in the world to turn and stand his ground. Now, you can't, in my mind, be the aggressor and put a set of incidents in motion and then claim to be the victim because the person actually tries to defend themselves. You're putting Trayvon Martin, and in fact, every person, period, in the United States in an untenable situation.
You know, it seemed to me that the prosecution couldn't figure out if they wanted to make this about race or not.
Right.
It seemed like they wanted it both ways, but yet they never were fully committed to saying, if the kid was white, the kid would be alive.
That's my concern. That's exactly my issue. And I think that in this case, given the initial comments that this man Zimmerman made, the fact that he countervailed the direction he was given to stay in his car, the fact that, as Mayo correctly points out, they have clear prior evidence of profiling. That's what this case is about. This is a racial profiling case.
But to that end, as I understand it, and you guys are the attorneys, and tell me if I'm wrong, given the stand their ground law in Florida, and given what they were trying to convict him of on second-degree murder, they had to prove that Zimmerman was full of either ill will, hatred, spite, evil intent when he pulled the trigger and he killed Martin. And the problem was, and I think we'll get into this later on in the program if the feds take this thing up, because he didn't say the N-bomb on the phone, and because he didn't clearly, when he said those people, it could be up for interpretation, we all know what he probably meant, but you know what you're saying, because he didn't have a swastika on his forehead or something, you have a hard time divining what was in his head when he pulled the trigger.
I don't agree.
Well, I think you don't, because if you get into the fact that he's contacted the police about all these other kids, you look at how many of those kids had done anything wrong. And if not a lot of them had done anything wrong, maybe there's an issue with George Zimmerman. But the other thing is that the prosecution had a rebuttal witness, and the prosecution chose not to really do their due diligence. Zimmerman is alleged to have assaulted an ATF officer, law enforcement, federal law enforcement officer. He got arrested and charged with that. So they could have brought that up. And in fact, the judge, I believe, was going to allow them to counter the suggestion that somehow he's a cream puff and that Trayvon Martin is a WMMA fighter. And you could have brought that up because the defense opened the door. And they weren't able to because they didn't do their due diligence to even find out where the guy was. So you'd think you would at least know that this is a person who's going to be our witness. And even more important, you don't need to actually testify in Florida because they have now incorporated the stand your ground law in the jury instruction itself.
I want to just do one thing, guys. At the bottom of your screen, everybody at home, you see a number there, 387662428, and that's our toll-free number. We're going to bring you at home into our conversation as well and ask if you think justice was served. And Dominic, I'm going to ask you the answer to the same question we're asking people at home here. With the laws in the books as convoluted and as bizarre as they are in Florida on this, was justice served? I've heard some people say there wasn't justice, but the jury got it right. What do you think?
The jury got it. The jury got it right. Excuse me. I firmly believe. I'm not going to be as diplomatic as the lawyers. I firmly believe those prosecutors threw the case. You can't convince me any other way. That was the worst prosecution I have ever seen in my life. And I did, you know, the Daily News printed Yusef Hawkins and Howard Beach. And so I did those cases. I know what good special prosecutors do. They are very aggressive. They dot every I, they cross every T. These guys, I don't know what they were thinking. They let Trayvon Martin get put on trial while George Zimmerman was portrayed as a saint. What prosecutor in their right mind, whether the merit's on your side or not, you got to fight a good fight, Richard. They didn't even put up the gloves. They just took the punches. Period.
Here's the key point.
And your reaction?
My reaction is that I can't comment on whether the prosecutors did what they were supposed to do because I'm not a lawyer. However, the mere fact that race was not brought into the courtroom and discussed as part of this case automatically swayed the jury in the sense that they had no choice based upon the evidence to go the way they went. Had they been discussing race along with all of the other issues, then I think we might have seen a different outcome. One of the things that's very clear to me now is, and I'm a child from the 60s, so I did the demonstration route, is that we have a problem in this country, which is the greatest country in the world, but we have a problem discussing race. On any kind of level, everyone gets extremely uncomfortable when you start talking about race.
And to that point, when people said this wasn't about race, of course it was about race. And to that end, I think it should be a part of it. Now, we're going to talk much more about the issue of race, and we've got a terrific panel for that on the other side of the break. And again, a reminder for you at home, join our conversation here, 387662428. What does this verdict say about where we are right now in this country? And that really after the verdict here, let's see what the consequences are. No charges for Mr. Zimmerman, and he gets his gun back. We'll talk about that and much more straight ahead.